So you argued in a recent essay for CGD that basically the World Bank really needs to rethink the way that it raises its capital to lend to other countries. And in January they announced that they had raised a record $52 billion for the International Development Agency, IDA, which is the fund for poor countries. But you said despite that success, they still need to rethink their model. And so can you explain to us a little bit why you think that fundraising model is outdated?
Sure. So I called the essay Shaking Up the Donor Shakedown, which is a little bit of a backhanded compliment to the bank. But the fact is, through the IDA fundraising process over many decades, they've been extremely successful in raising money from donors. The problem for them is that they potentially can be a victim of their own success, is that by having a model that works very well for one purpose, as the needs of that particular purpose, which is grant financing, low interest rate loan financing for the poorest countries, as the demands on that side of the bank's activities decline over time, there's simply less of a need for the scale of fundraising around IDA. In the meantime, there are other parts of the bank that have not employed anything like this kind of fundraising model, and it's those parts of the bank, something called the IBRD, the IFC, MIGA, where much more of the action is going to be in the years ahead. So my concern is that they are stuck in a particular model when it comes to how they obtain resources from their donors and shareholders that isn't going to suit their needs in the years ahead. Because of the basics of the financial models, you have the fact that IDA needs money from donors on a regular basis. It has to be replenished because it's giving grants out effectively or highly concessional loans. So it needs, every 3 years, it needs more donor money to ensure a level of assistance that the IBRD is not needed in the same way. Because of that, over time, over 17 rounds, what you've had developed for IDA is a very robust policy dialogue and policy making venue. In contrast to that, with the IBRD, so-called capital increases, their equivalent to a replenishment, have been ad hoc in nature. There have been 4 of them in the history of the institution compared to 17 replenishments for IDA. And that was very evident to me personally. I was a U.S. Treasury official at the time, and I was responsible for representing the U.S. government in these discussions, both in the IDA replenishment negotiations, but also in the IBRD capital increase negotiations. And it was just a very striking contrast in the processes that were employed for both. And it's really what started my thinking about taking all of the benefits and virtues of the IDA model and applying it more broadly to the bank as a whole.
So how would you do that? How would your idea work?
So in many ways, it's very simple-minded. You have an IDA replenishment process. The goal here is to employ much of that process, but simply expand its scope for the bank as a whole. So what I call for is an end to IDA replenishments, make IDA 17 the last, and when the time comes around again for what would have been the IDA 18 replenishment, the bank launches something called a bank resource review. It could include how big of an IDA do we want in the next 3 years, but it can also include a capital increase for the IBRD or the IFC. And these things will be brought together as a package. They would be concluded in the same kind of timeline that you see in a typical replenishment, about a year. And then at the annual meetings of the bank, when you have the meeting of the development committee, this is when the actual ministers come into town and sit down and meet together. This would be the formal adoption of whatever the outcome is of the BRR. The point is to create a process that allows for consideration of these issues and all in one setting around one table. And I think that will drive much more coherence around the bank group's agenda as a whole than we have today.